to Language Access Matters, the podcast where we pull back the curtain on one of the most important and most overlooked pillars of equity in this country, the right to understand and be understood. I'm your host, Carol Velandia, and whether you are a language professional, a healthcare provider, an advocate, or simply someone who believes that every person deserves a fair shot regardless of the language they speak, you are in the right place. Today's episode is a special one for me. We're sitting down with three interpreters, and they don't just show up and do the job, right? They have each gone a step further, building tools, systems, and resources that are making this profession better and the experience of limited English proficient individuals more dignified, more accurate, and more just. But before we meet them, I want to take a moment to talk about the organization behind this podcast. Equal Access Language Services was built on the belief that language access is not a luxury. It's a right. And for years, EALS has been doing the hard and glamorous, absolutely essential work of making that right real. Through professional interpreting and translation services, and also through advocacy and through education. And speaking of education, EALS has just launched something I am genuinely excited about. It's called Effective Inclusion to Language Access, a self-paced online course designed specifically for healthcare providers. Whether you run a major hospital system or a small neighborhood clinic, this course will meet you where you are. It covers your legal obligations under federal law, practical strategies for serving patients with limited English proficiency, and how to build a language access program that actually works, not just on paper, but in the room, in the moment, when it matters most. This course was built by people who live this work every day. Now, let's meet today's guest. We have Alejandro Lurati, founder of Bravo Savio LLC. He's an attorney, New York State certified interpreter, and one of the most creative thinkers in the language access space today. We have Marisa Rueda Will, a certified healthcare interpreter, a commissioner from CCHI, interpreter training, and someone who has been transforming medical interpreting from the inside out since 2006. And we have Monique Gomez, language access coordinator for the Allentown Municipal Court in Pennsylvania, practicing interpreter who has made it her personal mission to make sure justice doesn't get lost in translation. We're going to hear from all of you about yourselves in your own words in a moment, but let me say all of you are my friends. The work that you do every day is the difference between someone understanding what a doctor just told them about their diagnosis and leaving that appointment in the dark, as unfortunately many limited English proficient people do. It is also the difference between someone understanding their rights in an immigration court and facing a life-altering decision without the information they need. Language access matters, and these three people prove it. So let's get into it. It's so nice to have all of you. Why don't we do a brief introduction?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Marisa Rueda Will, and I have been a healthcare interpreter for 20 years. I worked at Mayo Clinic for close to 20 years and did a lot of their educational infrastructure building. And as a result of wanting to get more involved with the national scene, I started my master's to do more research. So you'll see some research coming out from me very soon. I just got IRB approval. And I started to go full-time with my company, Tika Interpreter Training and Translation. So I'm really excited for this new step and a new way to transform healthcare interpreting. And I love stories, so I'm really glad to be here today. Thank you for the invite, Carol. You're very inspiring.
That's wonderful. You each also inspire me. Alejandro, why don't you tell us about your company and where you are?
Hey, everybody. How do you do? I'm Alejandro. I founded Bravo Savio LLC in 2017, and my work focuses on that intersection of end-user technology, language access, and building systems that are usable in real life repeatedly. Yeah, I was trained as an attorney. I was trained as a sociologist, but I'm also, in my personal experience, party DJ, a professional MC, a soccer coach. And all of those kinds of things meld themselves together, cobble themselves together to create my approach. And thank you for having me so much, Carol.
Thank you. Monique, why don't you tell us about you a little bit?
Thank you for the invitation, Carol. I'm very honored to be around such accomplished colleagues in different fields. I started in the Allentown courthouse, but now I have been in the Eastern Northampton County courthouse for over 10 years, basically doing language access, making sure that people have equal footing and proper procedure in their language. I also am serving as the marketing director for the DVTA, our regional Interpreters and Translators Association, and that gives me the opportunity to meet a lot of interesting interpreters in the field and to be updated in what's going on.
Thank you. The reason why I invited each one of you is because each of you works in a very different setting, a courtroom, a hospital, and also immigration proceedings. So I was curious because each of you, in my opinion, do best practices in our profession. So what does that mean to you in your context? And how did you figure out what that looked like for you specifically? Who wants to start? Alejandro?
I'm happy to. I was looking forward to hearing the two people who have my dream job, but sure, I'm happy to go first. What does best practice mean in immigration environments? I think because it's such a cross-cultural environment, getting towards the highest degree of neutrality is the goal most of the time for me. This is a space that's full of asymmetry. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of consequence. And so I stay working towards neutrality because it's not something that's automatic. It really depends on the operator, the interpreter's discipline, their level of cultural awareness, their level of humility, their ability to resist the egos in the room, including their own. And I figured that out over a long span of time. I've watched all kinds of power holders dictated by ego. I've seen so many of our colleagues dictated by ego. And I've seen very important people do the exact things that we're trained never to do, like use Google Translate or ask a friend in WhatsApp to do things. So I think that when we start thinking about neutrality, that's the best practice. And that means, in plain terms, not just trusting vibes, not trusting status, not trusting a bilingual who's perfectly intelligent. They're self-confident. It means asking, are we truly helping everyone arrive at a similar understanding at the same time with the same materials? And that's a big task in immigration.
How about for you, Monique? What does that look like in your court?
Yes, I think with judicial interpreting, we have a very limited, very well framed way of that we can act. And it's sometimes it's hard to stick to it because real life doesn't match the scenarios we're taught in our orientation, in our training. And when you work in a courthouse for over 10 years, you face scenarios that you're unprepared for. So my North Star, the way I am able to discern what's right and what's wrong when it doesn't fit the rules that was given, it's always to think about equal access. Are my actions helping this LAP to have equal access to justice, full participation? And that's honestly what I find that helps me navigate those difficult situations.
And to you, Marisa, from the legal to the medical, how does that look for you? Best practices.
Absolutely. When I think about best practices, I look to the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare first and foremost. They created a code of ethics in 2004 and standards of practice for us in 2005. And with our field evolving and taking another look and seeing what needs to be updated, they're currently in the process of doing that. And it's really exciting to see that work being done, people caring about this, really getting in there. Originally, those principles were based on beneficence, which is sometimes confused with this concept of non-maleficence, which is not to do harm. But healthcare interpreting, like you said, it is different from legal, it is different from immigration because we do have this principle, this idea of acting in the patient's best interest. Listen to that. Acting in the patient's best interest by promoting good and going beyond do no harm to create a positive balance of benefit over harm. But not only is that one of our principles, but we need to be faithful to that message and that voice, preserving communicative autonomy, which is allowing each person in the encounter to be in control of and responsible for their communication at the same time. So we have these principles juxtaposing one another. And what it comes down to is what Monique was getting at is that just because we have a code of ethics or standards of practice, this is not an all-inclusive rule book for every situation. As practitioners, we have to look at the situation happening and think ethically about it, something that AI cannot do for us. And that is a very nuanced art. We preserve that person and their voice and their autonomy. And at the same time, we see the whole picture of the healthcare system, what's happening, what's getting missed in communication that's perhaps not being spoken, that may make the system fall through the cracks. And we have the ability to discern, does this require a mediation or not? And then act accordingly. What I use as my guiding principle in that sense would be a model that I found from ASL thought leaders, Dean and Pollard, about thinking about your options and then choosing the one that's going to cause the least negative consequences or minimizing those negative consequences. I love this question. This is the heart of the difficult work that we do. And I'm glad that we're having these discussions so that people realize we're critically thinking about these little things that may or may not need our attention.
Yes, and I love to hear that there is some action done to rebuild the code of ethics, because I am not knowing the full history of the code of ethics. It is true that sometimes it lacks where the reality is completely different from what the code says. And I love the concept that you have described just now about beneficence, which of course it doesn't apply the same way in the legal field. And this is part of the reason why it's so important to have the dialogue between among professionals in the different areas of public service. And one of the things that I admire of each one of you is that you each has developed tools, trying to go beyond, because from your experience, you realize, okay, what the code told me is not sufficient, for example, or what I learned in theory is not cutting it in this particular situation. All of those tools that you have created or the systems that you have created to improve your work and the experience of the limited English proficient individuals that you serve, I would love to hear, or I would love to showcase some of the examples of those tools. So for example, Alejandro, I think I met you over a year ago because of a tool. I think I shared something in one of the WhatsApp groups that was actually a tool to learn about language access laws and policies. And you being an attorney and also an interpreter in the immigration court, which is a setting where people's future can hinge on the accuracy and quality of your interpretation. So how did all that legal background that you have shape the way you interpret? And also, your background in communication helps you create those tools for your limited English proficient persons, your attorneys, your lawyers, so that you help people understand what's actually at the stake in the room.
Sure. Very concretely, before getting into anything heady or intellectual, during 2020, 2021, doing virtual hearings, it's imperfect today, but it was very much imperfect then. And I learned to use what's called overlays, an image laid over another image. These overlays were very useful in terms of court interpreting when I'm limited to being on a screen. Visual layers that said interpretation in progress. That might be bilingual. Might say pause, or something so simple as there's a recess, or there's an audio-visual issue. Now, I could do these things on command to make things robustly accessible, not only to the judge with whom I'm working, but also the attorneys, and most importantly, the understanding of immigration court purposes, the respondent in the room. So very concretely, my entertainment background, believe it or not, my party DJ, my service work is what lent itself for this and how to make robust language access measures in immigration court to what law school taught me. My legal training taught me how authority works on people. The average American might not by nature have any understanding of how an immigration court works. However, or often people will say, hey, a doctor said it, a lawyer said it, it must be true. So law trained me to understand how people treat authority in addition to learning about a burden, a timeline, what is ambiguity, what's contradiction. And the most important thing in terms of being accessible in immigration court that I cobbled together from all these interests was my ability to have good timing. And so to interject without necessarily interrupting and keeping a flow and learning to speak quickly and clearly and the delivery being so crisp. And those are things that maybe legal training didn't teach me. They're useful in legal environments. But I would say that these access measures in terms of my role as an interpreter, making things ostensibly clear to the onlooker, having a style that reads everyone's pauses, so I'm actually interrupting much less than interjecting.
Yeah, you shared with me that once you transferred to the in-person setting, you had signs so that people would know what was happening. And those signs were in Spanish. And that seems like such a simple solution, and it is so effective. They know what you're doing. They know that you are at a recess, and something so simple can really make the difference for the person having the experience, especially in such a difficult environment as an immigration court. I think having access to what's happening is great.
Something I like is when people say, oh, wow, that's magical, that's complex. I say, no. Our kind of culture of professionalism makes us talk like this. Oh, I'm a lawyer, I'm a sociologist. And I say, everything that I do is just right under our nose, that we shoot over most of the solutions I come up with.
Yeah. Monique, I had the fortune to interpret for your court and see how you operate as a language access coordinator in your court in Pennsylvania. So one of the things I observed, because I have worked for many courts in Maryland, so this was my first time in Pennsylvania, but it was the first time I actually saw all the tools that you have developed for the limited English proficient population. So you made it your mission to ensure that every document and form was translated at least into Spanish. And I want you to talk about that, how you started this process and what is the array of tools that you have for the limited English proficient, at least for those that speak Spanish.
I think I'm very lucky to be in Pennsylvania because we have the AOPC, the Office of Pennsylvania Courts, supporting us, and they really do a great job with that. With them, every courthouse has to develop a language access plan. And in that language access plan, we have a timeline for translating all the documents by urgency, budget, but not that we can get 100%, but at least is planned and we know what we need to be doing. We also have grants, which helps because one of the pushbacks is budget, the cost, especially if you have to do rare languages. We make sure that anything that is court ordered, therapy, alcohol and safety classes, even the instructions for checking in with probation with your cell phone, anything like that is translated, at least usually Spanish and Mandarin, because I believe we're the county in Pennsylvania with the most requests for Mandarin. So most of the forms have been translated. Custody orders. Also, we're very lucky that our judges understand that because they can find somebody in contempt or punish somebody for not following a court order if they can't understand what they have to do. Or if they sit in an alcohol and safety class for 12 hours and really they're not hearing anything, understanding what they're saying, what's the point of it? Batters assessments, all those things, it's if they don't understand, there's no reason for them to do that. The AOPC gives us a good base and we run with it because we have good judges that also support us.
Do you have any pushback? For example, if you translate a form into Spanish, and I think logistically speaking, how does that work? Can you walk us through it once the form is translated? Do you get any pushback from any office saying, "Oh, I don't understand this form because it's in Spanish" or something like that? Does that ever happen to you?
Oh yeah, we have pushback in small things and big things. For example, the divorce packet, the custody packet, all of that is translated and it's also available in our website, which is also in Spanish. And the way we have learned that this works best is doing it mirrored. So one side in English and one side in Spanish so that attorneys or the office where they're filing can read along. Of course, if they write something in Spanish or Chinese, then we get somebody to translate. But usually it's name, addresses, things the office can read. They, at the prothonotary, they were not accepting, they still don't accept people to file in those bilingual forms. So they use the Spanish as a guide, but have to file the English form. And there's other places where they're like, oh, we don't have room for more forms. So we have to make a little sign that says for Spanish, request this form in whatever place we put it, but things like that. And of course,
Nice.
budget.
Of course. And pretty much most forms are translated into Spanish. And do you use technology to help with the speed of this translation?
We do. And it has been honestly life-changing. We have pretty much daily protection from abuse orders in Pennsylvania, which restrictions orders in other states. And people, when I get the statement, I have approximately 5 to 10 minutes to translate it. Of course, I could do a side translation in front of the judge, and sometimes I have to because I don't have time to do it. But I've noticed that if it's printed, the judge gets like a better understanding because they can reread it. Sometimes people are so upset that they don't say everything that they want to. We have 5 minutes to do it, and technology helps make it a lot quicker. Also, for example, when the judge does the charging instructions for the jury, it could be 40 pages, and it's something they decide right before they're going to read it. So again, I only have 15 minutes to get that ready. And none of these things are presented to the judge without human editing because it still makes mistakes.
Of course.
Big mistakes, little and big mistakes. We're make sure there's somebody overseeing it, but it is helpful.
Just for clarity, you're using technology mainly or only for Spanish, right?
Yeah, because for final PFA, so we have the initial hearing and they file, usually one party, and then they have to come back, both parties. For that second appearance, there is going to be an interpreter, a live interpreter there. So before going into the hearing, the interpreter looks through the translation and makes sure it's accurate.
Thank you. And now, Marisa, medical interpreting is fascinating. It's a world where we can clearly see that the limited English proficient person, we don't have any trouble with defining that we want to have that beneficence that you were mentioning earlier towards the limited English proficient person. It's a very different setting from a court setting because that LEP is always in the good side, if you will. And then the medical interpretation, it's all about patient safety as well and clinical care. What are those common mistakes that you see, whether from institutions or providers or even interpreters? And how do you handle those situations? Do you use any tools? What can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. I was thinking about this question, and what I want to highlight from my experience is in the medical setting, yes, we have the advantage of being part of the medical care team, or at least that's an initiative that I'm really passionate about, is that as interpreters, we are an essential part of that care, something that we're working towards still to be seen in that way. Specifically in my hospital and many others, what I see as a primary challenge for us are the high rates of turnover in interpreter services leadership. In my 20 years, I had 12 leaders. I was counting this beforehand, 7 of which were monolingual individuals without experience in interpreting or language access, 5 of which were bilingual, and only 1 of which was bilingual and had experience in leadership or management. It's really hard to find a combination of an individual who understands the healthcare interpreting landscape and also has experience in leadership and or is aware of this concept of language access in general. Now, that's hard just in my department. As far as the people above them, I think it gets even fewer and farther between as far as the actual experience of language access. So when you were talking, Carol, about this tool that you created for language access in clinics and hospitals, this is very valuable. And I hope many of these leaders are listening right now because we need this. We need more education so that people understand how to shape these discussions, what issues are important, how to lean in on their interpreters, on their translators for guidance, because there's a lot of education that's usually needed for these leaders coming in as part of an orientation period where they're just really learning about the profession in general before they can even get started. Like I said, 12 leaders over 20 years, that's not even 2 years if you like spread it out. So somewhere even less than that, it's really hard to get your footing, let alone carry through initiatives. Another challenge that we face in particular is hospitals don't know where to put us, right? They don't know, do we belong to international? Do we belong in the Department of Patient Access? Yeah, at one point I heard we were perhaps going to get combined with food services as far as like the leadership overseeing us. Like it's truly a mystery as to where do language services fall? In what category do we put them? Do they belong in development because they also see international patients, depending on the clientele that they're seeing? The tricky thing is that healthcare interpreting, when they mandated Title VI and 1557 of the ACA, that didn't come with funding, right? It was a mandate, but there wasn't financial backing behind it. So hospitals, first of all, had to interpret what does it mean to provide meaningful access? And second of all, how do we comply with this without breaking the bank, right? Which is something that, as I just described in my example, first of all, you probably have individuals in charge who, in some cases, were voluntold to be there because they couldn't find someone to lead it or had limited experience, wanted to lead the best that they could, but perhaps didn't know how to navigate those situations. And then they didn't have the funding. So what happens is you get pressure from all sides and you try to come up with the easiest solution. And in healthcare interpreting, the easiest solution isn't always the best solution, right? So we hear in the worst of cases about individuals who have suffered traumatic brain bleeds or difficult amputations. There was a civil rights hearing not too long ago that they're going to be publishing in May, actually, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of that. That the consequences for individuals are real in these situations. And I think it's hard to put a value on the work that healthcare interpreters are doing. I think that's one of the difficult things is for a long time, there was this ideology in interpreting, at least in spoken language, of if you're a professional, your job is to be invisible. You're supposed to act as if you're not even there, and you're supposed to transmit these messages back and forth. When in reality, I think the best parts of my work are not necessarily being that conduit or just a non-thinking machine that transmits things back and forth, but an actual human who's processing this information, extracting the meaning from it, which right now, according to the recent Anthropic report, like AI has zero penetration in this ability to actually extract the meaning from what's being said, and to then reiterate that meaning. And not only that, but see through people's gestures, see through their tone. What is possibly getting missed here? Does that yes actually mean yes? Or is this had not, is this just because I want to appear that I know what I'm doing, or I honestly don't feel empowered to say any differently, and I'm just trying to get through this situation the best that I can. If anything today, Carol, like you inviting me here, truly, I believe that the things that I have done and I'm working on, like I believe anybody can do, right? And we need all hands on deck situation, right? Like we want interpreters to feel empowered. It's time for us to start having these conversations about what we're doing that isn't making us invisible, right? I don't believe that we should be, nor are we invisible. And the points of care that we're creating, that dialogue where we point out, like, interpreter wonders if there's a transportation issue here, getting from point A to point B. Can we navigate that together? These are really what's helping create access. I wanted to make sure to just get that out there because it's time we start talking about these things.
Yeah. It is very inspiring to start. Really, the idea that we are invisible hasn't served us well because it became an invisible need, right? Instead of taking it the way we should have been taken, like the communication should be so seamless that you don't notice that there is a person there facilitating, which doesn't mean the same as being invisible and unimportant. I think the connotation of invisible or the connotation of unimportant was what came after the idea of invisibility. And you're completely right about that. I also find similarities on when I was a medical interpreter for one hospital, how they didn't know where to put us. It was really interesting. And it helped me start thinking about language access and how hospitals really need to direct the effort to precisely patient safety, compliance, risk management. And this is why effective inclusion to language access was created, precisely to orient those leaders to point language access or to place language access in an office like development or somewhere where they can have a return on the investment, which is something I typically hear from leaders, is like, what's the return on the investment from a language access operation? But it's not so much that, but all the risks that it prevents, all the injuries that it stops, and that, unfortunately, that money is not accounted for. You only realize that language access matters when you have a lawsuit because of a mistake caused by a lack of interpretation. And absolutely, we should, as interpreters, share all these experiences. And really, we also need to get into language access because, believe it or not, I cannot say that most interpreters necessarily even understand the concept. You all, because you're here for that reason, because each one of you understand what language access is all about. It's not just about transferring from one language to another, but it's a whole system. And this is exactly why we need to do those conversations, Marisa. So thank you. I think it's right on the money. And you mentioned easy solutions that are not always the best. And I think that's a perfect segue to talk about AI-powered interpretation seen as a cost-saving measure. From where each of you sits, what do you think are the real-world consequences of replacing human interpreters with technology? And where do you think technology can actually be a legitimate tool? Alejandro, why don't you start?
Sure. Anybody who knows me has heard this way too many times. I'd love for the day to come where we can objectively budget and measure and quantify the cost of comprehension by all. That's the vital cost that institutions keep trying not to see. They refuse to budget for understanding and instead try to budget to skirt true understanding on a multilingual level even. And my critique personally, most for-profit, nonprofit foundations, whatever you do, they do it while spending lavishly on everything that does flatter the dominant culture. And that's usually my biggest critique. I'll say it very plainly. Somebody's vote for dominant culture is obvious, and I'm talking about administrators and people who budget. When the retreats and the optics and executive comforts are the focus of a budget instead of wraparound understanding services, multilingual materials, reviews and audits for the same, cross-cultural planning for the very people that they claim to serve or that they profit off of. And that's not efficiency. That is, on a cultural level, neglect with branding attached to it. And in immigration settings, understanding and having comprehension cross-culturally is at stake when we talk about people who have a different cultural logic to their storytelling or how they express their survival, how their memory is layered based on their culture and their language. And in the immigration environment, they want yes and no responses. That's what I talk about in my settings when I talk about comprehension and the cost of it. I talk about the cross-cultural understanding of basic things of comprehension. And going back to the thing that I started with, neutrality is a direct response to what Marisa was saying about being invisible, being the ethic a lot of our colleagues and ourselves were raised off of. So technology absolutely has a very legitimate role in support. But if the person in power is using technology to supplant the interpreter instead of support the interpreter or translator, then that's just dominant culture doing what it does, the same thing we for and most people fight against.
I think that's a great point. And I don't know if we will ever talk about replacement because, as Marisa discussed, all the nuance that goes into a yes and whether that yes was because you want to seem competent and not because you actually understood. Is AI ever going to reach that level of understanding of the human condition? So on that, Marisa, do you have anything to add with regards to replacing interpreters with AI?
Absolutely. That specific example was something I shared recently on LinkedIn about a story where I had an individual come in. This individual had been fasting for 3 days, driving 2 hours to this appointment, fasting, believing they were coming in for some sort of GI procedure. They came in for a consult. So prior to their appointment, they had gotten misinformation or they had not been clearly communicated with and did not understand, first of all, what was the appointment they were coming to, second of all, that they didn't need to be fasting for 3 days prior. And this individual worked every day, like at least 8 hours every day. And anyone who fasts for those procedures knows that they're not easy. And throughout the course of this appointment, the provider is creating a plan of communicating with this patient via the online portal system. Now, patients can receive text messages without being signed up to the online portal system, okay? So it's very confusing. And this patient was going along with the doctor's plan, being like, yes, great, we'll communicate about this plan on this system, right? Agreeing to this, saying yes, nodding. And I'm giving, as I said, I'm a huge proponent of communicative autonomy. I don't want to make the assumption that this individual is not on the online system. But every indicator that I can see, plus the context from which this patient's entering the room, make me believe this patient isn't on the system, okay? They're not going to be able to communicate with their provider. And so I did mediate and ask, interpreter speaking, interpreter wonders if the patient has the app or the account. Oh, the app? No, I don't have that. They didn't, okay? They did not. They were not connected to the system in any way. I interpreted for them with the tech help individual because it's not an easy system to get signed up for, especially if you don't have a home computer. aside from that, translating those messages themselves can be difficult. So you see all of the barriers there to communication. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't said something, this patient would have left, not been able to follow up, not been able to communicate, was wondering what's happening, why aren't they getting their text? But that's a separate system. AI, is AI going to be able to interject to draw attention to this possible misunderstanding or barrier? Speaking another language classified in medical terms is becoming more and more accepted as a social determinant of health, along with race, along with income, socioeconomic status, et cetera, as making it more likely that you will have poorer outcomes, right? So by replacing humans, you're just increasing that barrier, right? I think if anything, to really capitalize on the expertise that we have. We have staff interpreters, we have VRI, OPI interpreters who live and breathe in these situations, who are on the front lines doing this work. And I think personally, the best leadership is always having people connected to the day-to-day work to see what's actually happening to stay relevant. And to your point about interpreting, I love interpreting so much. I wasn't sure how I was going to fit that in, but I am doing some freelancing now. And when I go back to it, it's just such a joy to be able to assist people with that communication. A lot of it is for psychological exams. Okay, so patients coming in and they're really looking at what's the cognitive level here. And the partner wants to chime in or interpret sometimes or answer for them. Is AI going to be able to mediate that or mitigate that? I don't know. There's just lots of questions. And I think what it's going to come down to is this concept of ethical decision making and cultural nuance. AI can't understand what humans haven't taken the time to understand. There's still a lot that humans have to learn about communicating with one another, communicating across cultures, not just language, but understanding that the person sitting in front of you is a living, breathing person. They're their own person. They're not a stereotype. They're not a category. Just because they come from a certain family unit doesn't mean that they have the same beliefs as their family unit. They can be very different. So there's no one answer for everybody. It's not an easy fix.
Going back to the court system, Monique, lots of cases with people that are suffering. You mentioned the PFAs that you call them. You should probably explain to our audience what that means. So how?
PFAs are protection from abuse orders and are basically restriction orders. And we have them daily. And it's very important to us in the language department that if a survivor comes to the courthouse, that they don't leave without protection because of lack of communication. It's crucial because they can't go to an abusive home without this paper that protects them. I agree with everything Alejandro and Marisa mentioned. I have very similar views on that. I would add the issue of responsibility. When I have a PFA statement where the victim or the survivor was saying, he hit me, and the AI translated it as he raped me. Now, that's a very different level of aggression. And a judge would react very differently to that. If there isn't a human to review that and localization, handwriting, there's so many ways AI could interpret things wrong. Whose responsibility is it to acknowledge a mistake? Because this could have terrible consequences. This person would have criminal charges if that translation went out like that.
Yeah, there is still such a vast area where humans are still indispensable. And that's the whole area of ethics. And I think all of what you have been talking about in relationships with AI and technology, the area where you seem to have an objection is when that crosses into ethics and how do you handle that? So I just want to touch on this question about ethics and learn from you. Specifically, how do you set those role boundaries and how do you manage the stress caused by your daily situations? Can you share a moment where you had to hold that professional boundary and how did you navigate that?
You were talking about invisibility. It reminded me of this situation where I was interpreting and I couldn't hear the attorney, the DA, and I kept asking for repetitions. And he kept mumbling and he wasn't projecting. And it was a room with very bad acoustics. And finally, because I kept doing it so much, he got annoyed and he said, "It doesn't matter. The important thing is that the judge understands and he's hearing me okay."
So did you say something? Did you?
I can't because legally interpreting, you can't. So I just kept asking for repetitions because it is important that the LAP is his case. It's his freedom, his future.
You made me think of something that happened to me not that long ago, about a year ago, as I was preparing a talk that was related to ethics for the National Association for Judicial Interpreters and Translators. And by the way, the upcoming conference is in June. And we had a little bit of conflict, if you will, with the one co-presenter who thought that we really couldn't advocate, right? And they started talking about differences between the code of ethics and the work performance, your performance as interpreter, and working conditions. And I thought all of those feed the other. To your example, Monique, you cannot talk about ethical interpretation if you can't hear the person. So you have to have those working conditions in place to actually be ethical. It's like you can't separate them. So all of that has to be in place. Your working condition, your role boundaries, and your sense of your code of ethics. And Marisa, you had an example you would like to share with us.
Absolutely. Yesterday, I was listening to NPR and it was listening to the stories of 911 dispatchers. And they were talking about troubling calls that they would get from children, the majority of which were domestic violence calls. And they were asked to categorize the types of calls that they received from them. And they said domestic violence, the majority, some about the playground, some about a situation happening with a sibling. And then she says, and then also, children help us with translating, she says. Yes, but she says it so naturally. Like, we have language services, but sometimes the children can help us out. Like, they have this option to employ language services, but the natural response, something that this person felt comfortable sharing on public radio, was that children can serve as, not interpreters, of course, I believe she said translators. I have it marked. This was yesterday, April 13th, 2026, everyone. What I'm getting at here is this is a systemic problem, okay? This is not a problem that we're going to be able to solve on an individual level. That's where I got anyway in my practice. I found that if I really wanted to try to make an impact in healthcare interpreting, I was going to have to seek out others who had similar initiatives, start getting involved. And that's my message to anyone listening, truly. You can do this work, okay? We have organizations out there with such smart people. The NCIHC, I was fortunate to become a commissioner with CCHI. They're doing incredible work in the field of healthcare. We recently updated our ethics requirements so that individuals are going to have to be going back and studying ethics, working on some exciting stuff there about kind of humans versus AI sort of thing, like information that we can get out there, right? To interpreters, talking points, hopefully. we're not sure what shape it will take yet. So work in progress, but telling our stories, we have knowledge, we have the ability to make a difference. And we want to be empowered to be able to do that, right? If we're not there doing this work, AI isn't there. AI isn't able to do the work that we do. LSPs rely on us. Healthcare institutions rely on us to do this job. It's us, right? Without us, this cannot happen, this communication. I think we lose sight of that. And so my message here would be there are several levels. And if you're in a place where you feel like on an individual level you're not making headway or you're not really making an impact, there's still opportunities for you. Like in my state of Minnesota, they're having a Minnesota spoken language group right now where they're going through the whole process for interpreters that I signed up for. Just a lot of opportunities out there where we can potentially make a change. So even if it's just your story, come find me. I want to tell your story. Let's get it out there, people.
In fact, we do have a repository of stories that we are working on, and I'm going to link it. It's a part of an effort, Unheard Voices, and it has to do with this idea that children can interpret, for example. It started that way. Really, we have a lot of misconceptions. It is up to us to really help people understand our boundaries, our professional boundaries, so that we can really have a code of ethics. And there are so many things that we know we shouldn't be doing or that we think we cannot do that we need to also challenge. For example, filling out forms for a patient that, let's say that patient doesn't know how to write. And we get into all these big conversations, but it's not my job as an interpreter. I shouldn't be doing that. But my question is, should we open the conversation about this and understand really what is behind it? Why is it that we cannot do it? And should we continue with that decision? I'm not saying do one way or do another, but we definitely have to have this conversation about role boundaries and ethics that have to be updated, because I think that a lot of our conceptions are outdated already. So I love to hear that in the medical field, we're thinking about that. And I'm not sure about the legal field, but I hope it's also updating our code of ethics, because that really is what makes us different from the artificial intelligence, right? Emphasis on artificial, right? What makes human intelligence unique or better in any way? Thank you, Marisa. You're contagious, and I appreciate everybody's stories. I know that each one of you is focused and invested in your profession. My last question has to do with policy. There has been a lot of changes in language access and language accessibility in the past year. You hear about these different policies. So if you could get one thing, one policy or one resource, one change in how institutions think about language access, what would it be? And what would it mean for the communities you work with? Alejandro.
Absolutely. If I could change one thing, I would make institutions treat language access as core infrastructure and public legitimacy, and not as special treatment for somebody who hasn't learned English quickly enough. What does that look like? That looks like planning, budget, accountability, again, multilingual materials, and everything I'm talking about. In the same vein as what Marisa was saying, I am obsessed with looking up at the power holder and making the power holder accountable. I don't have any anger or rage against power holders, but what I do know is that power holders, somewhat unconscious or at best maybe superfluous, monocultural reflex, those are the issues that I have. And so having that accountability, and in terms of a business or a nonprofit, those elements equally available in every language from the start, and stop reading language exclusion as a community deficiency and start reading as an institutional failure to make itself accessible. And really quickly, other places have understood this for a while. I think last year, South Africa started giving robes to interpreters to make clear how critical their role is in a judicial environment. And even more recently, a CEO in Canada, and Canada has 2 national languages, was fired specifically because when there was a tragedy, this CEO decided to put out what they call a unilingual. In the United States, we say monolingual message. And it's not that Canada has two national languages. It uncovered how he had publicly been ignoring the fact that the public was saying, hey, try to learn the second national language. And so these are the types of examples that I think imply that core infrastructure is the way we need to think about it. And that language isn't a courtesy, it's legitimacy, it's operational dignity when it gets to multilingualism, right? And when institutions can really understand that concept, communities can meet these public systems, be they for-profit, nonprofit, government, with a little more faith and trust and reciprocity.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Infrastructure. Monique?
I think Alejandro nailed it. And in my little courthouse, the case I mentioned about the DA, I couldn't handle it in the courtroom because we're in the middle of a proceeding, but I had to email him, his boss. It's funny because we have training videos for personnel that is dealing with the public, but not for attorneys. And I think that would be very helpful to us to educate people in the DA's office, public defenders, about our role and the importance of it. Yeah.
Come take the effective inclusion through language access course. It's meant for
Yeah.
people that are not interpreters, that need to know about interpreters. So yeah, that's a great policy. Marisa, one policy, one rule, one tool that you would like to preserve or implement?
One thing, if I get one thing, I would like to see a policy with an implementation strategy for national certification of healthcare interpreters in hospitals. That's how hospitals run. If you don't have a license in nursing, you're not able to practice as a nurse. If you don't have the credentials to be a patient care assistant, you cannot act as a patient care assistant. They are very education oriented and focused. Credentialing is extremely important. We have that credentialing. With CCHI, they now have a monolingual exam even that individuals can take. So literally anyone is able to get a credential by passing an oral exam at a national level in this country. And I think it makes sense, common sense, to require your hospital personnel to have the basic qualifications to be able to serve your patients, your community. So if I could make one change, that's what it would be. Again, implementation strategy. We let people know this is coming. We build that infrastructure that's only going to increase the level of care for patients. We're going to get more education. We're going to get more training. We're going to get talented people coming into the profession and serving our patients. So that would be the one thing I would do.
Okay, so certification across the board, accreditation across the board. I think that's wonderful. Anything else?
Just to close, I didn't get to say one small thing just about technology and AI and everything, that there's an easy litmus test when we talk about AI technology, translation, and interpretation. Say, hey, power holder, would you let your mother, your daughter, your loved one get a surgery from a non-surgeon instead an AI model? Would you let your child cross the street to go to school with an algorithm that says whether there's traffic or not? Would you like your house to be monitored by a fire safety algorithm, or would you like firefighters? Asking these fundamental questions that imply the value of that human agency for now is a really good way to stop having people have these vague senses of optimism about technology.
Yes, I think when there is judgment to be made, humans are still necessary. Thank you. I think all of these things that each of you gave are excellent. I would also say language access needs to be like a ramp for people in wheelchairs. So it is an access thing. It's not a courtesy. It's something that enables somebody else to access services legitimately. I really want to emphasize language access is not a favor that a person with limited English proficient or any person that doesn't speak the dominant language of any country needs in order to be able to participate in equal footing with everybody else. Very inspiring to be with you all today. Thank you, Alejandro, Marisa, Monique, for the time that you gave me today, for all the work that you do every single day, and for the standards you hold, for the tools you have built, and also for refusing to accept that good is good enough when the person on the other side of that interpretation is navigating something that could change their lives. If today's conversation sparks something, share this episode, talk about it at your next staff meeting, send it to that colleague who keeps saying the bilingual receptionist can handle it. I have heard tons of times that they don't need language access because they already have a bilingual person doing it. Language access is a civil right, and the more people understand that, the closer we get to systems that actually work for everyone. If you are a healthcare provider, please go check our EALS course, Effective Inclusion Through Language Access. The link is in the show notes below. It is practical, it is accessible, and it was designed for organizations exactly like yours. No matter the size of your practice, language access is your responsibility, and EALS has made it easier than ever to get it right. This has been Language Access Matters. We will be back with another episode soon. Until then, keep building bridges, keep holding the line. Remember, when everyone can be heard, everyone is better off. Thank you.
And that wraps up another enlightening episode of Language Access Matters. We hope you have enjoyed our discussion on the profound impact language access has across various sectors of society. Let's remember that language access is not just an isolated topic. It intertwines with various fields, impacting lives and businesses in profound ways. As we continue this journey together into becoming a more inclusive society where we ensure equal access to services to those who don't speak the dominant language, we want to assure you that our company, Equal Access Language Services, through its podcast Language Access Matters, will be with you every step of the way. We are committed to bringing you thought-provoking conversations, expert opinions, and stories from the field and beyond. To dive deep into the subject matter and engage with leading experts in the field, we will release a new episode of Language Access Matters once a month. By featuring expert practitioners and individuals with diverse experiences, we aim to broaden the scope of our discussions and present a comprehensive view of the importance of language access. We encourage you to stay connected with us through our website, www.equalaccesslanguageservices.com, and our social media platforms. You can join the conversation, ask questions, and share your own stories and experiences. If you want to be part of our podcast, email us to podcast@equalaccesslanguageservices.com. Remember, language access matters to each and every one of us. By understanding its significance and actively working towards its advancement, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society. Thank you for being a part of the Language Access Matters community. We appreciate your support and look forward to sharing more knowledge, inspiration, and empowerment with you in our future episodes.